My name's Damian Mackey. I'm one of the joint project managers at the Southern Tasmanian Regional Planning Project. The other joint manager, Emma Riley, can't be here today, so you'll have to put up with me. I'd like just to acknowledge Alderman Rob Valentine down the back there, who is the chair of our steering committee for the Regional Planning Project. So, and today...
It's always good to have the boss present.
Yeah, so it's just made me a bit more nervous. So I'll jump straight in. So the Southern Regional Planning Project, what is it? It was kicked off in 2008 with the signing of an MOU between the state government and the 12 Southern Tasmanian councils and commenced in March 2009. It's managed by the Southern Tasmanian Councils Authority, which is the regional grouping of the 12 councils in Southern Tasmania, and largely funded by the state, but with strong in-kind support and involvement from the 12 councils. And we have significant engagement from the state agencies as well, but with the state government being a partner in the project. And we've also engaged significantly with the infrastructure providers, other stakeholder groups, and we've done some community consultation exercises through the project as well. The two major outputs of the project is, number one, a regional land use planning strategy for Southern Tasmania and a suite of contemporary and consistent planning schemes for councils in the region. I want to point out that this is just the first iteration of these documents. What we need to set up is to make sure that there's a system put in place into the future to continue on this work. With the project time and money available, we've only been able to go a certain way. Emma and I acknowledge that there's lots of other things that need to be done, and of course there's always going to be ongoing issues that rise up, such as, I imagine, the growing importance of peak oil into the future, that need to be taken into account and built into future iterations of the strategy and the planning schemes. The need for this project, well, there's been no regional strategic land use planning in the south since the early 1980s, when the old Metropolitan Master Planning Authority died. Since then, Greater Hobart has just grown willy-nilly, with each council doing their own strategic planning exercises within their own borders, but no overall overarching strategy. There's has been no state planning policy direction other than for the protection of agricultural land. There's a policy on water quality and a troubled policy on the coast. But other than that, there's been no top-down direction coming down for a whole range of issues. If people wanted to see how a state could provide very strong direction into the planning system, you could look no further than the Victorian planning provisions, where about the first 50 or 60 pages of every planning scheme over there is the state direction to the planning system. We have a non-system of planning schemes in Tasmania, and for that you could read it's a dog's breakfast of planning schemes. They're all different. They've all been developed in different eras. Some are almost 30 years old, over 30 years old. Some are relatively new, and there's a whole range of different philosophies and methods, to the extent where a term in one planning scheme might be the same as a term in another planning scheme, but has a completely different legal meaning. And of course, the recognition of our inefficient and costly settlement patterns, lost opportunities, social inequities, and recognising the challenges ahead, which are many, but certainly include peak oil. Output number one, the regional land use strategy is completed, almost. As of last week, the 12th of our 12 councils endorsed our draft regional land use strategy. We are now sending that to the Minister for Planning to consider declaration as a statutory regional strategy. So we now have a single document that all 12 Southern councils have endorsed. Once the Minister declares this regional strategy, it will be declared under a certain section of the Planning Act, which was changed a couple of years ago to allow for this, and once it's declared, all new planning schemes and planning scheme amendments will have to be consistent with this planning strategy. So it actually does have teeth, and it will actually mean things on the ground. Output number 2 being the suite of new planning schemes we are now working on as fast as we can in partnership with our member councils. So we hope that the new schemes will be available for an informal public consultation in early 2012. Just want to point out this, that the existence of a regional planning strategy and the suite of consistent planning schemes will actually provide a system where new policy initiatives can be inputted into the system and easily promulgated down into the planning schemes in a much more efficient way than has happened in the past. In fact, our system in the past, being a non-system, has just been completely made this sort of thing very difficult, if not impossible. So I guess what I'm flagging is that as we develop more policies into the future to address things such as peak oil, if we can get this system in place with the strategy and the new schemes and a system to maintain them, then it will be so much easier from an administrative and policy point of view to implement new initiatives. And part of the MOU between state and local government does flag the idea of state and local government agreeing on a regional planning system to provide for this into the future. Now, I'll just speed through here, but what we've done is produce 14 background reports, which are available on our project website, which I'll give you at the end of the seminar. As you can see, we've tried to address a whole range of issues there, including climate change and so on. But everything from physical infrastructure, social infrastructure, hazards, industrial activity and providing for housing needs. We have a vision, a vibrant, livable and attractive region providing sustainable growth opportunities that build upon our unique natural and heritage assets and advantages of Australia's southernmost region. But I'll also point out that the STCA is progressing a specific visioning process that many of you would have seen bits and pieces in the Mercury over the last 6 months, I think, which we are trying to develop up a much more robust vision statement and much larger vision statement with significant community consultation. The 10 strategic directions in our strategy talk about an integrated approach to planning and infrastructure, holistically managing residential growth, a network of vibrant, attractive activity centres, increased responsiveness to the natural environment. All this information is available on our website, which I'll give you at the end. But our chief 15 policy areas are these ones here: biodiversity and native vegetation, water resources, the coast, managing risks and hazards, cultural values, recreation, open space, social infrastructure, physical infrastructure, land use and transport integration, tourism, strategic economic opportunities, productive resources, industrial activity, activity centres, settlement and residential development. Greater Hobart needs to be planned as one settlement. We haven't done this in the past. If we want to, one of the major aspects, which I'll go into a bit later shortly, is the fact that we recognise we need to increase the density of our settled areas. We need to make more use of them. We can't continue on at the rate of expanding out at the fringe that we have, not just for issues such as peak oil, but for a whole range of other issues. And as I said, Greater Hobart for 3 decades has not been planned as one settlement. Residential growth has expanded wherever individual councils have felt it could be. Infrastructure providers have then raced along behind, trying to catch up and service these areas which have popped up, and we have issues like at the southern beaches where these multi-million dollars worth of water and sewer infrastructure needs to be put in there to address what are now significant environmental issues. We just need to make much more use of our land and our infrastructure. We have one of the least dense of Australia's cities and the most aged. Larger houses on larger lots predominate. This will not match our housing needs in 20 to 25 years. We'll need a much greater proportion of smaller dwellings on smaller allotments in close proximity to services, simply from the point of view of our ageing population. But of course, a more dense settled area has so much benefits in terms of addressing the challenges that peak oil would provide us. So we need a more efficient pattern of settlement for economical reasons, social reasons and environmental reasons. And as I said, we need to plan for Greater Hobart as a single region. So what are we trying to do as part of the strategy? We're proposing to tighten up on the expansion of rural living around our fringe. In normal suburbia, we think we should be aiming for 15 dwellings per hectare minimum, which is the density at which things like public transport and the provision of other infrastructure starts to become more sustainable. Within inner suburban areas, in the inner city areas, we believe we should be aiming for 25 dwellings per hectare. Battery Point is an example that has achieved that sort of density, and Glebe here is very close to that. So we're not talking about massive high-rise development when we talk about high density in the context of Tasmania and Greater Hobart. We're just talking about getting away from single houses on huge blocks. We're not saying we've got to get rid of all of that. The world is not going to change overnight, but this is where we need to start heading towards. We need to consolidate and strengthen our existing activity centres and coordinate infrastructure provision and land use planning. If we have a more dense settled area, then public transport becomes more viable in more areas. We lessen our carbon emissions. We will all pay less for all forms of reticulated infrastructure. It's one of the hidden subsidies in expanding out suburban expansion at the fringe, is that in fact the people living in the inner city, more dense areas are actually subsidising the people living out in the less dense areas. I live in Newtown, and I pay the same electricity tariff as people living out on the fringe in a rural residential area. They might have a power line that runs for 10 kilometres and serves 100 people, whereas Aurora, servicing me, probably services 1,000 dwellings in one kilometre of power line. So yet we're all paying the same tariff. I'm not saying we should start introducing a system which would be truly market-based if people the further out were paying more for their infrastructure, but I'm just pointing out that there are these hidden subsidies in the system which promote the expansion at the fringe, and if we should actually just recognise those things. And if we did recognise those things, then the sort of headlong plunge of so-called cheaper development on the fringe would be recognised for what it actually is. We're actually all paying for that. Of course, there's our good agricultural land and threatened vegetation communities and significant landscapes out there. Yes, we've got a lot of undeveloped land out there, supposedly, but when you start looking at all the values and all the risks and hazards out there, there's not a huge amount of good land out there that we could continue expanding out anyway if we wanted to. How's that map coming up? Growth scenarios. Not coming up too well, but this is the residential zone land in Greater Hobart. Here you can see the Derwent River coming up through there. Now, if we were to continue expanding at the same density that we are at the moment, we're going to need this much area of land in the next 25 years, somewhere around Greater Hobart. Now, as you can see, that's quite a lot of area when you think of all the land that's not available for reasons of slope and vegetation and so on. This is where our target is, or our anticipation growth is 26,500 new dwellings in the next 25 years. We've been in the past, we've been expanding with 85% greenfield dwellings to 15% infill dwellings at the rate of the expansion areas of 7 to 10 dwellings per hectare. So that's what would happen if we continued on with those things. If we, all our expansion areas on the fringe, if we got to 15 dwellings per hectare, we would only need this much land. If we can change our proportion of infill to greenfield from 85 to 15 to 50-50 infill to greenfield development, we start to reduce even more. And this square down here represents the area of land that if we had 50-50 greenfield to infill development, over the next 25 years, and where we expand, it's at least 15 dwellings per hectare. So just looking at those squares and the amount of land we need, you can see how we're going to need a lot of land if we don't change the way we do things. So part of our strategy work, we have been looking at our region in sort of two levels of detail, I suppose. In the broader region, we've looked at less level of detail, and we have focused a lot on Greater Hobart, because as I said before, it hasn't been planned as one settlement for so long, but so much proportion of the population lives in Greater Hobart, and what happens in one part of Greater Hobart has reverberations from a land use planning sense that go around the whole Greater Hobart area. But a more dense Greater Hobart area generally will improve the resilience to impacts of peak oil, but as I've mentioned before, will mean more efficient use of all infrastructure, reduce our ecological footprint, increase social integration, more people living closer to services and employment, increased economic viability of public transport, greater range of housing choices, and promotion of health and wellbeing through making walking and cycling becoming more viable, and agglomeration potential for activity centres where you get more activity, more things happening in those activity centres. So the key aspects of our Greater Hobart settlement strategy, number one is an urban growth boundary. Okay, we can't talk about increasing densities in Greater Hobart if we still turn back the clock to before, where each council is sort of going off on their own and expanding their own. We need one urban growth boundary, which is basically that, and that needs to be quite strict. So through this regional land use strategy, that's what we're proposing to do. We have identified greenfield development precincts in there. We are talking about allowing for development over the next 20 years, again with the 50-50 infill-greenfield ratio. So we have identified in close consultation with the infrastructure providers to determine where it's most efficient to, for their point of view, to provide that infrastructure, where the future residential development areas are. These areas here are our infill target areas, where in working with each council in determining the new zones in the new planning schemes, where appropriate opportunities are, we want to have the inner residential zone. The state government has recently completed its revision of the statewide template for planning schemes, which sets the broad framework of planning schemes and provides standard zones. We believe that there are opportunities within Greater Hobart, particularly say 400 up to 800 metres from the major transport corridors and principal and primary activity centres, to provide for inner residential zoned areas where we have that 25 dwellings per hectare overall target, recognising that some suburbs such as Battery Point are already at that area, but also recognising that that would have to be tempered by local heritage precincts. For example, Hobart City Council have done a huge amount of work in coming up with their draft planning scheme provisions on the local character and local heritage areas. 2 minutes. So that is they are the major components of the Greater Hobart settlement strategy. And of course, we've created that in the context of a broader regional settlement strategy, where we've identified growth scenarios for the smaller settlements out in the broader region. And looking on our website, you'll be able to see all our background reports and all the information we've taken into account, but obviously urban transport corridors shown on that map there are quite critical. Regional transport corridors as well. This map here, all these scattered areas shown coloured here, that's actually the significant agricultural land. One of the challenges of our project has been to identify where our significant agricultural land is. We don't have in the south any prime agricultural land as per the definition in the state policy. We have about 3 paddocks of that, but nevertheless we have very significant agricultural land, which with irrigation would be very, very productive. But that just shows you sort of in the Sorell, Cambridge, Coal River Valley area, even surprising up around Oatlands and the East Coast, that there is quite a lot there. So when you think about all this significant agricultural land, it really does narrow down the ability for Greater Hobart to expand into the future, its urban footprint. I haven't got the natural values and all that on there as well, but for those other reasons, as well as peak oil and the need to just be more sustainable in a overall sense, are the things that are driving our strategy in terms of trying to have a more sustainable and efficient settlement pattern for Greater Hobart and Southern Tasmania generally. And that's our website up there. We have all our documents up there at the moment. We've actually just taken down the actual strategy document itself because we're just reformatting that in its final form to send that off to the Minister for Planning, but a whole range of background reports and other documents, our consultation report and so on that we did last year is all up there as well. So thank you, Margaret.